The wind curled around the valley's edges like a living thing, dragging pale mist through the dry grass and whispering down the half-frozen creek that slithered past the roots of the old cottonwoods. Coldcreekvalley was a place people forgot, a seam between hills where the land seemed to exhale in long silences. The first light of dawn filtered through thin gray clouds, just enough to turn the frost on the fence posts into a faint silver shimmer. It was the kind of morning that slowed time, or made it feel like it had stopped entirely. Eli Mercer moved along the trail with the deliberate steps of a man who had walked the same path so many times the dirt knew his soles by name. His canvas jacket flapped against his sides, its frayed cuffs stiff with old wear. The brim of his hat was pulled low, but his eyes scanned the tree line out of habit more than necessity. Not that anyone came here, not anymore. His breath curled before him like smoke from an old fire, fading before it mattered. He had lived here alone for almost 4 years, surrounded by little more than rusted fencing, broken barn doors, and the ghosts that had followed him back from the war. Ghosts that didn't rattle chains or whisper through walls, but haunted in quieter ways, in the way his hands trembled when thunder cracked too close. In the way he never stood with his back to a door. He had forgotten how to talk to anyone who hadn't once worn a uniform. The trees ahead thinned where the trail curved along a limestone outcrop. The sound of the creek grew louder there, faster over the rocks. Eli paused, boots crunching against frost-bitten leaves, and tilted his head. Something was off. The air carried more than just the chill. There was a weight to it, a quiet too sharp to be natural. He stepped forward, instinct driving his legs while his thoughts tried to catch up. The bend in the trail revealed the creekside clearing. He expected to see the usual shapes of fallen timber and the lichen-covered boulders. Instead, he stopped dead. There was a mass near the base of a cottonwood. At first glance, it looked like a mound of shadows, or maybe a collapsed tarp left behind by hunters. But then it moved. Just barely. Eli squinted. His hand dropped automatically to his side, where a sidearm no longer hung. It hadn't in years. Old habits stayed even when the weight was gone. He stepped forward cautiously. The closer he got, the more the shape took form. The curve of a flank. The droop of a heavy mane. A tail limp across the frosted dirt, and chains, thick rusted iron links wrapped tightly around the base of a massive neck. A horse, number. A stallion, black as volcanic rock, its coat streaked with dried mud and blood. One of its legs trembled. The rest of its body stayed still, folded awkwardly, as though it had collapsed rather than lain down. Eli's throat tightened as he took in the damage. The chains weren't just restraints, they were punished. The skin beneath them was raw and broken, scabbed over in places, oozing in others. There was something else, too. A piece of paper, yellowed and wet at the corners, was taped to a strip of cracked leather tied around the stallion's neck beneath the chain. It fluttered slightly in the breeze. Eli knelt slowly, ignoring the cold that bit through his jeans. He didn't reach for the chain, not yet. His eyes met the horse's. He had seen wild eyes before, on the battlefield, in the mirror. This was different. These eyes were ancient, not in years, but in weight, as though they had stared down at the worst of the world and now only endured because there was no other choice. No fire, no fight, just survival. Eli reached for the note. The tape resisted before giving way with a damp snap. He held the paper between 2 fingers, careful not to tear it. The handwriting was slanted and rushed. His name is Brimstone. Too wild, too dangerous. Can't break him. Forgive me. The last 2 words staggered on the page as if the writer had hesitated before pressing the pen again. Eli stared at them for a long moment. Then his gaze returned to the stallion. Brimstone. The name felt wrong and right all at once. Not because of the implied danger, but because it echoed something Eli knew too well. A force built to carry pain. Something people used until it was broken and then discarded. He didn't speak. Not yet. Words felt too brittle for this moment. Eli reached out, one hand open, and touched the stallion's neck just below the chain. The skin twitched, but the horse didn't flinch. A breath passed between them, slow and shivering. For a heartbeat, the entire valley held still. Then Eli moved. He stood and walked a slow circle around the tree, studying the chain's anchor point. Whoever had done this had not intended for the horse to leave. Multiple wraps looped around the trunk, twisted back on themselves with knots of rusted iron. It would take time. And a blade. He returned to Brimstone's side and knelt again. His knife came from the sheath on his belt. It wasn't a rescue tool. It was a worn army blade, half-dulled and sharpened too many times on bad stones. But it would work. Eli slid the tip between two links and began to work. The metal squealed, and the horse's ears flicked back. He paused, murmuring nothing in particular, just sound meant to steady. Slowly, link by link, he carved at the chain. The process was agonizing, not from the effort, but from the nearness of the wounds. Each time he freed a section, he revealed more damage. Flesh rubbed raw, skin hardened into a callus, or wept from infection. The horse didn't cry out. It barely moved. It only breathed. Eli kept working, one hand steadying the chain, the other moving the blade. The wind hissed through the trees, pulling at the note where it lay near his boot. Brimstone's breath grew steadier. His body slumped slightly, no longer tensed for pain. When the last loop fell with a soft clatter, Eli exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for years. The stallion didn't move. Not yet. Eli sat back on his heels, hands scraped and sore, and looked into the horse's eyes again. There was no fear there, no trust either, just recognition. A mirror does not trust you, it only shows you what you are. The sun finally broke through the clouds above, slanting down in a beam that lit the clearing in pale gold. Dust motes danced in the still air. Eli stood slowly, the cold forgotten. His legs were stiff, his hands throbbed, but something in him felt clearer than it had in a long time. He looked down at the great horse and whispered, "You're free now." Brimstone shifted. His eyes stayed on Eli. Then, slowly, as if testing the truth of what had changed, he lifted his head. The wind carried no answer, only silence. The kind that speaks, and just like that, the last quiet morning of Eli Mercer's old life ended. The chain lay coiled on the ground like a shed skin, rusted and heavy, symbolizing everything that had kept Brimstone tethered to suffering. Eli stood over it, his boots dusted with frost, and the faint reddish smear of old blood where the lynx had dug into flesh. The stallion remained motionless, afraid that the freedom offered was only temporary, a dream that would be snatched back at any moment. The valley around them had not changed. The trees still swayed in the slow wind. The creek murmured on with its disinterested rhythm, but something unseen had shifted. Eli could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the way one feels an aftershock long after the tremor has passed. He crouched again, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off the horse's side. His hands hovered, unsure whether to offer comfort or distance. He studied the grooves the chain had left in the animal's hide. Some were old, scar tissue lacing over faded bruises. Others were fresh, raw, and angry. A long streak down the left flank had crusted into a ridge of dried blood, mixed with streaks of dirt and what looked like grease. Someone had made sure Brimstone stayed bound, not just physically, emotionally, before Eli found him beneath that tree. Whatever had happened to him had not been done in haste. It had been deliberate, prolonged, personal. Eli pulled a strip of cloth from his coat pocket, a torn sleeve from an old shirt he kept around for cleaning tools. He dipped it in the creek, let the cold water soak through, then returned to Brimstone's side. The stallion watched him but did not shy away as Eli pressed the cloth gently against the worst wound at the base of his neck. The reaction was a tremble, not a flinch, not fear, just pain. Eli spoke softly as he worked, not because he thought the horse understood words, but because silence felt too sharp. His voice rasped from disuse, like sandpaper on dry wood. "You held on too long," he said. "No one should have had to." He didn't say what he meant. He wasn't sure if he meant the horse or himself. The cloth came away, streaked with blood and filth. He rinsed it in the creek again and returned, cleaning with a patience born from years of field dressings and battlefield triage. He had done this for men who bled out before being saved. The difference here was that Brimstone stayed. Memories stirred as he worked, not of wounds or bandages, but of another life, before the desert, before the dust. Before Jonah's scream had echoed through the canyon of his mind so many times, he no longer heard it as a sound, but as part of his own pulse. Jonah, always laughing, always first to take the point, always turning around to check if Eli was keeping up. Until the day he did not turn. The day the ground exploded and the sky came down, Eli found nothing left of his friend but silence and ash. He blinked and returned to the moment. The stallion's breathing was slow but steady. His eyes remained open, watching, absorbing. Eli knew that kind of stare. Soldiers wore it, prisoners too. The look of those who had endured more than they should and survived without understanding how. He cleaned until the water in the creek ran pink with diluted blood, and the cloth was too tattered to use again. He tossed it aside and sat back, his legs stiff from crouching too long. He studied Brimstone in full daylight now. The horse was enormous, not just in size but in presence. His head, broad and angular, looked carved from stone. Though matted and snarled, his mane still retained streaks of a strange deep black that caught glints of blue in the sun. His hooves were cracked but solid. His ribs showed, but the muscle beneath hinted at power waiting to return. Whatever he had been before the chain, he still carried it somewhere inside. Eli exhaled slowly. The last thing he wanted was to bring something else broken into his world. But Brimstone wasn't just broken. He was burning quietly, a slow fire under ash, the kind that waited for wind. Eli said you were meant for more than this, unsure if he spoke to Brimstone or the reflection of himself he saw in the horse's gaze. A noise startled them both, a crack of branches deeper in the woods. Brimstone's ears twitched, his body tensing. Eli rose to his feet, scanning the trees, his muscles coiled instinctively. But nothing came. The wind shifts directions, pushing through the trees like a whispered warning. He needed to move. They could not stay here. The clearing, for all its solitude, was not safe. Brimstone could barely stand, and the cold would not be merciful. Eli returned to the tree where the chain had wrapped around the trunk. He studied the knots. Whoever had left Brimstone had done so with finality. No intention of coming back. No hope of anyone else coming either. The links had been doubled, tripled, and welded in sections. There had been fear of escape and what the stallion would do if he did. He touched the bark where the chain had bitten deepest. A shallow groove remained, a scar in the tree's flesh mirroring the one on the horse. And on him. Eli returned to Brimstone and knelt again. "We have to go." Brimstone made no move. He simply watched. Eli stood, then circled to the other side, nudging at the stallion's flank. Still nothing. He fetched a branch from the edge of the clearing and waved it over Brimstone's head, gently. A flick of the ears, a blink, but no movement. He's given up, Eli thought. That truth landed hard. He had seen it before. In the eyes of soldiers who had lost more than blood. In men who sat through firefights, not ducking, not moving, because they no longer believed they could die any more than they already had. Eli dropped the branch and sat down in the dirt beside the stallion. "If you won't stand for yourself, then maybe stand for me." The stallion breathed out a long sigh. Then slowly, with a shiver that passed through every sinew, he shifted one front leg forward. The effort was immense. Eli could see the tendons strain and the ribs ripple. Then the second leg moved. Brimstone pushed up from the ground in stages, awkward, shaking, nearly collapsing, but standing. Eli rose beside him, reaching for the makeshift lead from the old harness strap. Brimstone didn't resist. He only stood, sides heaving, legs trembling, but upright. "That's it," Eli said quietly, "one step at a time." He began the walk back to the ranch with Brimstone following slowly. The trail was uneven, the cold biting deeper with every passing minute. But neither man nor beast stopped. The chain was gone, the scars remained, but the walk had begun. When Eli and Brimstone reached the ridge above the homestead, the wind had picked up. It howled low through the pines, carrying the scent of distant snow and stirring the dry grass into restless waves. Below, the ranch lay slouched against the slope, its outline blurred by time and neglect. The barn looked especially skeletal now, more shadow than shelter. Eli stopped, one hand resting lightly against Brimstone's neck as the stallion hesitated behind him. "You made it this far," he murmured. "Just a little more." The horse's chest heaved in long, laborious pulls. His flanks twitched, muscles spasming from strain. The walk had nearly undone him. Still, he had followed. Not from trust exactly, but from some quiet pact neither of them had spoken aloud. Survival had its own language. Eli guided Brimstone down the path. His boots slid in the loose gravel, and twice he had to plant his weight hard to keep from falling. The stallion stumbled once, nearly folding, but righted himself with a grunt and a jerk. That he was upright was a testament to something deeper than strength, will, or stubbornness. Maybe they were the same thing. Eli opened the barn door with both hands at the yard's edge. It groaned in protest, wood grinding against warped hinges, the sound sharp enough to make Brimstone startle. Eli moved back quickly, hand up, calming. The horse's ears flicked, then stilled. Inside the barn, dust hung in long golden beams of light that cut down from broken slats in the roof. Cobwebs wavered like ghosts in the eaves. The air smelled of old hay, rot, and something that might once have been leather. Eli stepped inside first, testing the floorboards with each step. He cleared a stall on the left side, tossing aside brittle straw and the remnants of a broken halter. Then he returned to Brimstone, took the lead rope again, and gave it the gentlest pull. "Come on, just a few more steps." Brimstone's hooves struck the threshold with hesitation. One step, then two. The barn darkened around him like a cave swallowing light. He froze in the center of the aisle, head low, nostrils flaring. Eli waited. He did not pull again. He only stood at the edge of the stall, one hand resting on the open gate, the other hanging loosely by his side. He did not speak. Words were often a wedge when silence was what built bridges. After a long minute, the stallion moved. He passed Eli slowly, each hoof landing with the weight of a man walking through water. He stepped into the stall, turned awkwardly, and collapsed to the straw in a heap of ribs and breath. The wood shuddered under him. A puff of dust rose like smoke. Eli crouched beside him. The horse was trembling. Not fear exactly, not pain alone. Something older, resignation. Eli recognized it because he had worn it. He reached out and laid his hand on Brimstone's neck. The stallion did not flinch. His skin twitched, but he remained still. The first real touch, not during the rescue, not while cleaning wounds or guiding steps. This was different. This was presence, a connection unforced. A breath passed between them, then another. Eli let his fingers sink into the thick mat of the mane, finding tangles and burrs and dried blood. He worked gently, untwisting the knots. The horse's ear turned slightly toward him, not away. Outside, the wind continued to sing through the trees, but inside the barn, the air settled. The weight of noise lifted. Eli spoke again, his voice quieter now. "They said you were dangerous." He didn't laugh, but the edge of his mouth twitched. "I guess they said that about me, too." He didn't expect an answer, but Brimstone blinked once, slow and heavy, the kind of blink that felt like a door closing softly. It was the most deliberate response Eli had seen all day. He stayed there for a while, sitting in the straw beside the horse, breathing in rhythm with another living being. It was a strange feeling, being mirrored, being accompanied. The silence no longer echoed in his chest. Later, he brought water from the well in an old tin bucket. Brimstone drank 3 deep gulps before resting his head against the stall wall, too tired to continue. Eli laid his jacket beneath the horse's jaw to keep it off the hard boards. The light faded slowly from the barn, sinking into the grain of the wood until only outlines remained. The cold crept in, curling around the edges of Eli's boots, but he did not move. His eyes traced the lines of Brimstone's battered body, the cuts that crisscrossed his flank, the way his ribs rose too sharply, the streaks of old scars that vanished under matted fur. But there was still breath, still warm, still life. "You're not done," he said aloud, just to see how the words sounded. Brimstone didn't stir, but his breathing deepened, slow, measured, as if he had been waiting to hear that. Eli stood at last, knees cracking, back stiff. He looked down at the stallion, then at his hands. They were coated in dirt, old blood, and hair, but they were steady. He stepped out of the stall, latched the gate, and made his way across the barn to the old cabinet by the tack wall. It was barely upright, its drawers jammed and warped. He pried one open and found an ancient brush, stiff but usable, a jar of ointment, a roll of gauze. He brought them back and laid them outside the stall. He wouldn't use them tonight. Brimstone needed rest more than treatment, but it felt right, having them close. A plan is forming, a future. He turned off the barn light and stepped into the dark yard. The stars were beginning to appear. Cold Creek Valley stretched out before him, vast and indifferent, but it did not feel empty now. Inside the barn, a breath huffed, a hoof shifted. Presence. Eli crossed the yard to the house. The porch groaned under his weight. The door stuck before it opened. Inside, the air was stale with dust and time. He lit a match, coaxed a fire into the hearth, and sat on the edge of his old bed upstairs. He didn't lie down, not yet. His back ached, his hands were raw, but his chest was lighter, as if something had been placed beside the burden rather than added to it. Down in the barn, a broken stallion lay breathing. Up in the house, a broken man sat listening. And between them stretched the first thread of something new. Not healing, not hope, not yet, but something, the first touch. Morning arrived without color. The sky above Cold Creek Valley was a pale sheet of ash, seamless and still. The sun did not rise so much as seep into the world like a slow breath through gauze. Frost covered the grass in silvery blades. From the porch of the weathered house, Eli could see his breath hanging in the air like smoke as he stepped into the yard, hands buried deep in his coat. The barn loomed ahead, silent but not lifeless. A faint sound drifted through the cracked boards, not quite a whinny, not quite a groan, but something in between. It was enough to quicken his step. Inside, Brimstone lay as he had the night before, still folded into himself, but his ears twitched at Eli's approach. That small sign was enough to anchor hope. Eli crouched by the stall, peering through the slats. The stallion's eyes met his, less dull this morning, though ringed with the exhaustion of something that had refused to die. "You're still with me," Eli murmured. He stepped into the stall with slow movements, careful not to startle. Brimstone's head shifted slightly as Eli set down the bucket of water and the tin of oats he had found in the back of the storage cabinet. The feed was old, but not spoiled. Brimstone sniffed it, lips twitching uncertainly, then nudged at it with his nose before taking a single bite. That was more than Eli had expected. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." He didn't speak again as he went about his tasks. The barn was quiet, save for the creak of wood and the rustle of straw. He cleaned what he could, layering fresh bedding from the driest bales still stacked in the loft, brushing out some of the tangles in Brimstone's mane with the old curry comb. The brush was dull, its teeth bent, but it served. He didn't go near the worst wounds, not yet. The chain scars still oozed at the edges, and the flesh was swollen, too sensitive to touch. Instead, Eli focused on the periphery. Small acts, soft strokes. Not to heal, not yet, but to remind Brimstone that hands could mean help. That was not all. Pressure was pain. By noon, light filtered in enough to reveal the dust dancing in lazy swirls. The barn warmed by a degree or two. Brimstone shifted again and managed to sit halfway upright. Eli watched him with quiet awe. The stallion was finding the strength to defy stillness. Eli took a break and sat against the barn wall, legs stretched in front of him. He pulled a flask from his coat pocket and drank not whiskey, but black coffee gone cold. He thought about the last time he had taken care of anything other than himself. Not since the war. Not since the house had emptied and the world had turned down its volume until only memory remained. Now there was a heartbeat in the barn beside him. Now there was a weight other than his own sorrow pressing into the air. Late in the afternoon he walked the perimeter of the property, checking fences he hadn't checked in months. Not because he thought Brimstone would run, but because it mattered again. The land, though still barren and bitter with winter's bite, felt watchful as though the valley itself had noticed the change. When he returned to the barn, he found Brimstone standing. The sight stole the breath from his chest. The stallion's legs wobbled under his weight, but they held. His neck curved low, head swaying as he adjusted to balance. His ribs showed more clearly in the upright position, stark ridges against black hide, but his eyes were awake now, alert. Eli stepped forward slowly. He held no rope, no lead, just presence. Brimstone turned his head, not in fear, not in challenge, simply to meet Eli in the space between them. "You're not done," Eli said again. He moved to the horse's side and ran his hand along the curve of the shoulder, fingers brushing over old scars and dried blood. The skin flinched under his touch, but the horse did not pull away. "Good," Eli whispered. That night, the barn remained lit with a single oil lantern hung from the crossbeam. Its flicker cast long shadows that danced across the floor. Eli sat on an overturned feed bucket, watching Brimstone chew slowly through another small tin of oats. He wasn't eating much, but it was consistent, measured. Progress. He thought again of Afghanistan, of desert nights when the wind howled like wolves, and the only light was the orange glow of cigarettes hidden in cupped palms. He remembered Jonah, always the last to sleep, always the first to laugh, even when their boots melted in the heat of mortar strikes. He remembered the night they lost him, the way silence had followed the gunfire like a blanket over a grave. He closed his eyes now, listening to Brimstone's breath. Each inhale and exhale was a drumbeat. Each movement is a declaration. "You're here," Eli whispered into the quiet. "No one is tying you again." It was the first thing he had said directly to the horse with certainty. The words felt heavier than they sounded, like a promise. Brimstone blinked slowly, then lowered his head, letting his muzzle rest lightly against the gate of the stall. Eli rose, brushing straw from his coat. He turned off the lantern and left the barn in silence. At the house, he stood by the fireplace, watching the flames with a stillness he hadn't known in years. He could feel the fatigue in his bones, but it was different now. Not the weight of despair, but of effort. Real, honest work. Purpose returned. Sleep came easier than it had in a long time. In the morning, he would bring fresh water and try to clean the deeper wounds. In the morning, he would start rebuilding the stall that sagged against the east wall. In the morning, he would lead Brimstone to the edge of the corral and see if the stallion could walk a circle in the snow. One step at a time, the resurrection had begun, not with fanfare, not with miracles, but with breath, with presence. With a broken horse and a man who finally understood that healing was not a moment, it was motion, the frost deepened overnight, turning the world to glass. Grass blades stiffened into icy needles, and the wooden porch steps of the ranch house glistened with a thin skin of frozen dew. When Eli opened the front door that morning, a breath of cold wrapped around his face, and he paused before stepping outside. The barn stood dark in the grayness, its roof edged with snowmelt that had refrozen into curling icicles. He carried a fresh bucket of water in one hand and a folded blanket in the other. His boots crunched over gravel and dead leaves. The silence was sharp and absolute. Somewhere out in the distance, a raven called once and then was gone. Brimstone was already on his feet when Eli opened the barn door. The stallion stood swaying slightly, legs planted in uneven defiance of the weakness in his frame. Eli let out a slow breath. "Good morning," he said. The horse turned his head slowly. There was a focus in his eyes today, not alertness exactly, but awareness. The kind of look that said he had woken not just because his body demanded it, but because something inside him had noticed the world again. Eli stepped into the stall, set the bucket down, and knelt to check the wounds. The chain scars were dark with dried ointment from the night before. The swelling around the neck had gone down slightly. He peeled away the old bandages with steady hands. The stallion flinched once but did not resist. He worked in silence, replacing the wrappings with fresh cloth soaked in cooled herbal balm, then gently laid the blanket over Brimstone's back. The horse shifted under the weight but did not shake it off. The gesture was met with a stillness that Eli recognized. Not peace, however, tolerance trust, was not built in a single day. It could be shaped like clay warmed by fire. Later, as the afternoon sun climbed behind the clouds, Eli opened the corral gate and stood at the center of the barn aisle. He clicked his tongue softly and waited. Brimstone stood just inside the stall, ears forward, watching him. "Come on," Eli said. The stallion's hooves shifted on the straw. He stepped forward slowly, inch by inch, as if uncertain whether the invitation was real. The moment his head passed the stall gate, Eli took a step back, letting space open between them. Brimstone followed. They moved through the barn, Eli walking ahead in a straight line, not pulling, not prodding, just leading. Brimstone's hooves clunked softly on the wooden planks, a sound so ordinary it almost made Eli smile. The barn door stood open, and the cold rushed in like an eager crowd. Brimstone hesitated at the threshold, sniffing the air, testing it. Then, with a deep breath that steamed from his nostrils, he stepped into the light. The corral was empty, except for drifted snow piled in the corners. The fencing leaned under years of disrepair, but it would hold. Eli walked to the center and turned. Brimstone stood behind him, chest heaving, legs planted as though the sky might fall if he moved again. Eli opened his arms slightly. "You're not chained anymore." The stallion looked at him for a long time. Then, slowly, painfully, he took a step forward, then another, until he stood beside Eli in the center of the yard. There was no celebration, no grand signal, just motion. That evening, Eli sat at the kitchen table, a worn piece of notebook paper in front of him, and a pen in his hand. He had not written in a long time, not since the funeral, not since the letters stopped arriving from the men he had once called brothers. He thought of Jonah again, the way he used to grin sideways during briefings, like none of it mattered. The way he used to call Eli the quiet storm. He wrote a single sentence across the top of the page. "He stood today." Then he set the pen down. That was enough. The fire in the hearth crackled low, and the room filled with the familiar scent of ash and pine. Eli stood to add another log when the sound came. A scream. Not human, not sharp. A deep, broken sound that clawed up from somewhere inside a nightmare. He froze, the log still in his hands. His eyes snapped to the window. Nothing but the night outside. Black trees, faint snow, the wind. Then another sound. Hooves, fast, hard, striking dirt and stone. Eli dropped the log. His body moved before his mind caught up, old instinct rising. He grabbed his coat, threw open the door, and stepped into the cold. The barn door was ajar. Light spilled from it in a thin wedge that barely touched the yard. And in that light, just beyond the gate, Brimstone reared. His front legs struck the air once, then pounded down. His chest heaving, head swinging. Eli saw the wildness in his eyes and recognized it instantly. Terror. But not from threat, from memory. He approached slowly, arms low, voice steady. "Easy. It's okay. You're here. You're safe." The stallion's hooves struck again, kicking at the shadows that no longer existed. His ears were pinned, his breath loud and uneven. Eli stepped closer and Brimstone turned toward him, nostrils flaring, muscles twitching. Eli stopped. Right there. He saw it then. The breach. The moment when the past returned too strongly and drowned the present. He had lived with that breach for years, had woken to it, slept through it, survived around it. It was not a crack. It was a flood. He took another step. "I know." Brimstone stood still. Eli moved to the side, slowly reaching out. His hand met the stallion's neck where the muscle still trembled. He pressed gently, grounding the touch. "I know what it is to see what isn't there, to feel what isn't now." Brimstone exhaled in a gust. The sound was ragged, torn. "You're not alone in it." They stood together in the cold. No wind, no movement. Eli let his hand stay, not forcing calm, only offering it. Brimstone lowered his head slowly, the tension bleeding from his shoulders. Eli reached forward and rested his forehead lightly against the stallion's neck. "I still see the fire, too." He did not know how long they stood like that. The world outside could have spun a dozen times. But when Brimstone's legs steadied, when his breath evened, Eli knew the worst of it had passed. The stallion turned toward the barn and Eli walked beside him. Together they entered the warm, dusty dark. Eli closed the door behind them. Inside, the lantern burned low. Brimstone walked to the edge of his stall and lay down with a groan that sounded more human than animal. Eli crouched beside him and whispered, "You came back. That's all that matters." That night, he did not sleep. He stayed by the stall, his back against the boards, listening to the rhythm of the breath beside him. There was no peace in the quiet, but there was something else. Resilience. The first breach had come, and they had made it through. The wind shifted the next morning, carrying with it the distant scent of snow. The trees along the ridge line whispered in long sighs, their needles trembling in the breath of the coming front. Cold Creek Valley felt expectant, like it had paused to listen. The sky above hung heavy with low clouds, tinged with a steel gray that meant flurries before dusk. Eli stood in the doorway of the barn, arms folded, watching Brimstone move within the stall. The stallion had risen easily that morning. His gait was still uncertain, but stronger, more deliberate. He walked from corner to corner, snorting now and then, stretching his legs in small arcs that hinted at old grace waiting to reemerge. The chain scars across his neck had begun to darken into stiff scabs. The swelling had reduced by half. His coat, though still matted and filthy, showed hints of its former sheen beneath the crusted layers. Eli had spent the morning brushing out knots and dirt, not out of duty, but as if trying to uncover the shape of who this creature had once been. The name on the note still echoed in his mind. Brimstone. Too wild, too dangerous. Eli thought of the night before. The scream, the flailing hooves, the flood of memory, and then the stillness that followed. The way the stallion had pressed his head into Eli's shoulder was like something blind in the dark, searching for a wall to lean against. Dangerous was the wrong word. Haunted was closer. And Eli understood haunted. He carried a bucket of fresh water into the stall. Brimstone watched him but did not step back. That was new. There was a steadiness in the stallion's gaze this morning, as if the old fear had lost its grip just enough to allow curiosity to stretch its legs. As Eli set the bucket down, he heard something he had not heard in weeks. Footsteps. Not an animal, not imagined. Boots. Slow and heavy, crunching over frost and gravel. Eli stood, turning instinctively toward the sound. He moved out of the barn into the yard, scanning the tree line. A figure approached along the winding trail that led from the south ridge. Older, shoulders stooped with age but not frailty. A man in a dark brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat, moving at the deliberate pace of someone used to the land and unbothered by distance. Eli stepped forward cautiously, not out of fear but out of habit. The man raised a hand in greeting. "Morning, Jack." Eli blinked. It had been a long time since anyone called him that. The stranger came closer, his voice carrying the worn lilt of long-settled Spanish. "You always stared like a tree was about to fall on you." Eli frowned, but then recognition broke slowly across his face. "Luis?" The man chuckled and stopped at the edge of the yard. In his hands was a basket wrapped in a checkered cloth. The scent of something fresh and warm drifted out like a memory. "You're gonna let an old man stand here freezing, or invite him to sit?" Eli hesitated for only a second, then stepped aside. "Come on in." Luis followed him through the barn doors and set the basket down on an overturned crate. He pulled off his gloves and looked around the interior with sharp eyes that missed nothing. When his gaze landed on the stall, it lingered. Brimstone had turned to face them. His ears flicked forward, his nostrils flared. Luis removed his hat and stepped slowly toward the stall. "Well now, there you are." Eli watched carefully. Brimstone remained still. The old man crouched outside the gate, elbows on his knees, hat in his lap. "That's a war horse if I ever saw one," he said quietly. Eli tilted his head. "Do you know horses?" Luis chuckled again. Lived in Wyoming all my life. If you don't know horses by now, the land itself spits you out. He studied Brimstone's body, the line of his legs, the slope of his neck. That one was bred to run and fight, not pull carts or dance in parades. His size, his posture, that kind of power comes with a price. He looked up at Eli. Where'd you find him? By the creek, chained to a cottonwood, left to die. Luis nodded, unsurprised. And you brought him back? Eli didn't respond. Luis reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin of salve. Try this. Made it for my gelding years ago when he tore his flank on a barbed fence. It's got sage, yarrow, and a bit of pine tar. Smells like hell, but works like a prayer. Eli took it with quiet gratitude. You always carry this? The old man shrugged. I don't carry much, but when something tells me to walk, I listen. He gestured to Brimstone. He didn't pick you by accident. Eli stiffened. What do you mean? Luis leaned forward again. Horses like that don't give their trust easily. Not even when they're dying. If he followed you back here, it's because something in you matched something in him. Eli looked down, suddenly unsure what to say. Luis stood slowly, brushing his knees. People talk, you know, around town, about the soldier who came home and never really came back. The one who walks the valley like a ghost in his father's boots. Eli's jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. Luis's voice softened. You lost someone, we all know, but I think you found someone too. He pointed to the stall. That horse? He's got enough fire left to light a small town, but it'll burn him up if no one helps him carry it. He placed his hat back on his head and turned toward the door. I brought you bread, still warm. Eat something, Jack. You look like you've been feeding your ghosts instead of yourself. Eli followed him to the threshold. Luis stopped once more before stepping out into the cold. One more thing. Yeah? Name him something new. Whatever they called him before, it's not who he is now. Then he walked back the way he came, disappearing slowly into the trees. Eli stood in the doorway for a long time, holding the tin of salve in one hand and the scent of bread in the other. Inside the barn, the stallion stood tall, his head turned slightly toward the light. A horse. A war horse. A mirror. Eli whispered the name again under his breath. Brimstone. Then, slowly, he shook his head. Number. You're not what they called you. You're what you choose to become. He stepped back into the barn and closed the door behind him. The cold pushed out and the quiet sealed in. The first guest had come, and he had not come empty-handed. The next morning dawned with a pale silence. Snow had fallen in the night, just a dusting, enough to paint the world in hush. The branches of the pines sagged under thin white weight. The sky hung low and heavy, colored like worn pewter. Eli stood at the barn door, his breath curling in front of him as he stared at the narrow trail that led toward the creek. He had not walked that way since the day he found the stallion. He had not wanted to, but today, something in him said it was time. Behind him, Brimstone stood at the stall gate, watching. The stallion's eyes were calm, and the swelling along his chest had finally begun to recede. His movements were stronger now. His gait had firmed. There was color in him again, color beneath the darkness, as though his blood had remembered how to move freely. Eli pulled on his coat, slipped a small glass jar into his pocket, and stepped into the snow. The wind moved only gently, like fingers smoothing over old cloth. The land was quiet, the kind of quiet that did not ask permission. He did not take the direct route. He let his boots follow the uneven trail, the one worn by memory more than use. It led down through a hollow where the frost clung to dry grass and over a crumbling fence post that had once marked the boundary of his father's grazing line. As he walked, he remembered. He remembered the smell of scorched sand and diesel, of sweat and metal and powder. He remembered the silence after the blast, the ringing that had become part of his hearing. He remembered Jonah's body sprawled beside him, the stillness, the heat. The way everything afterward had felt like a long fall with no end. When he reached the clearing by the creek, he stopped. The cottonwood still stood, crooked and hollowed, bark scarred and broken where the chain had once cut into its flesh. Snow clung to its base, The indentation in the ground where Brimstone had lain was faint now, smoothed by time and wind, but Eli could still see it, could still feel it. He crouched beside the tree and pulled the jar from his pocket. Inside it was the note. "His name is Brimstone, too wild, too dangerous, can't break him, forgive me." He had not opened it again since that day. The paper was stained and warped and the ink faded in places, but the words still burned. He unscrewed the lid and laid the jar gently into the earth. He dug with his hands, scooping cold soil into a small hollow beneath the tree. The act was slow, deliberate. When it was deep enough, he placed the jar inside and covered it again. A grave, not for the stallion, but for the name, for the chain, for the cowardice of someone who had given up. He stood and pulled the knife from his belt. Not the sharpest anymore, not polished. The wood of the handle was worn smooth from years of sweat and sun. He approached the tree and pressed the blade into the bark, just above the scar where the iron had once sunk deep. He carved slowly, careful not to slip. "Midnight is home now." Each letter carved with pressure, like pressing memory into stone. He stepped back, wiped the blade clean on his jeans, and let the silence settle again. Then, behind him, the sound of wheels on gravel, laughter. The voices of children. He turned. From the tree line came a cluster of bright shapes. 5 or 6 kids on bicycles, bundled in thick coats and scarves, their breath puffing in front of them like steam engines. A girl in a purple scarf rode slightly ahead of the others, her eyes wide as they reached the creek and saw the man standing beneath the old tree. They skidded to a halt, tires crunching over ice and snow. One of the boys pointed across the water. "Hey, look at that horse." Eli turned and saw that Midnight had followed. The stallion stood quietly behind him near the bend in the trail, his dark frame cutting a bold silhouette against the snow-covered slope. The wind caught his mane and lifted it gently. His breath steamed from his nostrils in slow, steady bursts. The children stared. One of the girls stepped off her bike and walked closer, her boots crunching in the frost. She paused at the edge of the creek, staring across the small gap. "Sir," she called, her voice hesitant but clear. "Can we touch him?" Eli hesitated. Every instinct said no. Midnight was still healing, still wary, still half-wild in places. He looked at the stallion. Midnight did not flinch or retreat. He simply stood, head lifted, ears pricked, eyes calm. Eli gave a single nod, one at a time, quietly. The girl crossed first, picking her way over the shallow stones. The others followed, now hushed. The spell of childhood awe had settled over them. The girl approached with one hand outstretched. Midnight lowered his head, slowly, carefully, until his muzzle hovered inches above her palm. She touched him. A giggle escaped her lips. She turned back to the others, eyes wide. "He's soft." The next child stepped forward, then another. They gathered around, each taking a turn, brushing his neck, stroking the coarse mane. Midnight endured them with a stillness that bordered on regal. He closed his eyes once, as if soothed. Eli watched, his chest tight with something he could not name. This was the stallion they had called too dangerous, too wild. Now he bowed to the gentlest of hands. One boy leaned close and whispered, "You're not scary, you're sad." And that somehow felt like the truest thing Eli had heard in years. When the children had all taken their turns, they stepped back and returned to their bikes, still whispering, still throwing glances over their shoulders. As they rode away, one of them shouted, "Thank you, horse!" and another added, "Thank you, soldier!" Eli turned toward Midnight. The stallion's eyes met his. "You're teaching me," he said softly. Not sure if he was heard, not sure if it mattered. He rested a hand on the stallion's shoulder. "Teaching me how to live again." The snow continued to fall in thin, drifting flakes. The creek murmured beneath its icy crust, and beneath the cottonwood tree that once held chains, the words "Midnight is home now" carved into bark stood as quiet proof that not everything broken stays broken forever. Snowfall blanketed the valley by morning, turning every familiar path into a soft maze of white. Eli stood at the top of the ridge that bordered the northern side of his property, surveying the expanse below. Midnight stood beside him, his breath curling into the crisp air, mane flicking lightly in the breeze. The stallion had grown stronger. His steps no longer wavered on uneven ground. His gaze met the horizon now, rather than staying locked on the ground before him. Together they looked down at the stretch of land that rolled out beneath them, and Eli felt the strange hum of peace settle in his chest. But like all things hard-won, it came with a cost. From the corner of his vision, movement caught his eye. A pickup truck was crawling along the dirt road leading to his ranch. Not a neighbor. No one drove out here in winter unless they had a reason. Eli narrowed his eyes as the truck came closer. Black, wide tires, no ranch logos on the doors. The kind of vehicle that looked like it had rolled through more than one storm and come out meaner on the other side. He turned to Midnight. "Come on." They descended the ridge, moving as one. Midnight's hooves sank softly into the snow, quiet and sure. By the time they reached the house, the truck had pulled up in front of the barn. Two men stepped out. Both wore heavy jackets, but the shape of the man on the left made Eli's stomach tighten. Broad, stiff shoulders, a face like a busted fence post, rough and splintered. The man on the right looked younger, but had the same cut. Military boots, eyes that scanned everything with rehearsed detachment. The older man called out, "You, Eli Hayes." Eli nodded once. "And you are." The man took 2 steps forward, his boots crunching the frozen ground. "Name's Rudd. I worked the old Penner Ranch, east of the gorge. We had horses, good ones, not like the mess you picked up by the creek." Eli didn't respond. Rudd's eyes flicked to Midnight, then narrowed. "That horse has blood on it. You don't know what you brought home." Eli's jaw clenched. "I know what I found." Rudd sneered. "You found a killer. That stallion broke a boy's ribs in Reno last spring. Crushed another gelding's neck in a stable out in Idaho. They kept moving him from ranch to ranch. Nobody could keep him until someone gave up and left him chained in the dirt." Midnight shifted behind Eli, sensing the tension. His ears flattened slightly, but he did not move forward, did not bolt. Eli took a step toward the men. "He's not what he was." The younger man scoffed. "They never are, until they are again." Rudd's eyes burned. "We came to take him. I've got a trailer just past the hill. We'll handle it clean. No sheriff, no papers. We'll bring him back where he belongs." Eli's voice dropped low and steady. "He belongs here." Rudd looked him over, lips twitching into a bitter smirk. "You think because you're broken you can fix what's worse?" Eli didn't blink. "I don't fix what's broken, I walk with it." The older man stepped forward again, his hand brushing the edge of his coat. "Don't be stupid. You've been alone up here too long. You forgot how the world works. That animal's a time bomb. You want a child dead on your conscience?" Eli shook his head slowly. "I've seen death. I've held it in my arms. That horse isn't a bomb. He's a survivor, and no one's taking him." The younger man's hand moved toward his side. Midnight stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, but solid, present. Rudd turned his eyes back to the stallion. For a moment something flickered in his expression. Uncertainty, hesitation, maybe even fear. The younger man muttered, "You want to make this ugly?" Eli stood his ground. "It's already ugly, the moment you showed up." He gestured toward the road. "Leave." Rudd's stare lingered. "We'll be back. This valley doesn't forget the dangerous ones." He turned without waiting for a reply, and both men climbed back into the truck. It roared to life, wheels spitting slush and gravel as it turned around and headed back the way it came. Eli watched until the taillights disappeared behind the tree line. Then he turned to Midnight. "You okay?" The stallion huffed once through his nostrils as if answering. Eli ran a hand down his neck. "You've got ghosts, so do I, but nobody gets to put chains on you again." They walked back toward the barn together, silence stretching between them like a long, familiar road. Inside the barn, Eli pulled out his old notebook. He wrote, "2 men came for him today, called him a killer. He didn't flinch. Neither did I. Then he paused, let the ink sink into the page. He wrote again. Not all who are feared are dangerous. Some are just misjudged. That night, as the wind picked up and snow began to fall again, Eli sat beside the fire with Midnight's stall blanket draped over his knees. The storm howled against the windows, but inside the house held strong. He had faced war zones half a world away, but now his battle had come home, quiet and mean, wearing the face of old ranch hands and forgotten deaths. They wouldn't stop, he knew that. Men like Rudd didn't back down from what they didn't understand. They crushed it. But this time, Eli wasn't alone. He stood, walked to the barn and found Midnight dozing, eyes half closed, breath slow and steady. Eli leaned against the stall gate. We'll be ready next time. Because he knew what was coming, not just confrontation, but a reckoning. And this time he wasn't the only one with fire in his heart. Snow continued to fall for 3 days without pause. By the time the sun broke through, the valley had disappeared under a thick, glistening sheet of white. Fences had become outlines, rooftops heavy with burden. Trees looked like they had been dipped in icing and left to freeze mid-dream. Eli shoveled the path between the barn and the house in slow, wide strokes. Midnight walked behind him, not on a lead, but close, step for step, like a shadow with a heartbeat. The stallion had adjusted to the snow with surprising ease. His heavy hooves found purchase even when the ice tried to deceive. His presence was constant now, as much a part of the ranch as the wind and pine. Eli had not spoken much in the past 3 days, not even to the old ranch radio he usually used to pick up weather updates and the occasional AM gospel station. He was waiting, listening, knowing that silence does not always mean peace, just a pause before something shifts. Then on the 4th day, it came. Not the truck this time. A letter, tacked to the barn door with a hunting knife. Eli spotted it after morning chores. The wind had fluttered the edges, but the paper held firm. He pulled it free with a single motion and read in silence. You've got until the first thaw, then we're coming. With more than a trailer, no name, no return, no signature, just threat, just promise. He read it twice, then folded it and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Midnight was standing just behind him, ears pricked forward. Eli looked back at him. They want to scare us. Midnight snorted quietly, shaking his mane. They might succeed if we let them. Eli stepped into the barn and walked to the small wood stove in the corner. He pulled out the letter, struck a match, and fed the paper into the flames. It curled black immediately, edges crumbling into glowing orange veins before collapsing into ash. He watched every second. Then he turned to the notebook resting on the feed shelf. His father's old ledger, long repurposed into a journal. The leather was cracked, the spine was stitched back together more than once. Eli opened it to a blank page and began to write. The snow quiets everything but the truth. Some men deliver it with guns, others with silence. I've known both, I've been both. He paused, then wrote, I will not run, not anymore. Afterward, he saddled Midnight, not for a ride of retreat, but of intention. The stallion stood still as Eli tightened the girth and swung himself up. There was a strange thrill in being astride a horse that had once been called unrideable. The kind of thrill that came not from control, but from trust earned one quiet moment at a time. They rode down the valley road, the snow crunching beneath them like glass breaking underfoot. The world around them shimmered with reflected light. Eli knew where he was going, not in town, not to the sheriff's office, but to the ridge. Lewis was waiting when they arrived. The old man sat on a low bench made from a broken fence post and an old saddle stand. A thermos of coffee rested beside him. He didn't stand as Eli approached. He just lifted his eyes and smiled. I figured you'd come. Eli dismounted and nodded toward the thermos. That's for me? Luis chuckled. 1 cup, but I'll share. Eli sat. Midnight wandered a few steps away and began pawing gently at the snow-covered grass. They're coming back, Eli said. I know, Luis replied. They left a letter, gave me a deadline. Luis took a sip of coffee. And are you scared? Eli looked out over the ridge. Number. Just tired of being tested. Luis nodded slowly. That horse changed you, I can see it." "He hasn't changed me," Eli said. "He reminded me." "Reminded you of what?" "Of the man I used to be before I started apologizing for surviving." Luis set the thermos down. "Then he's worth defending." Eli nodded. Luis leaned back, his eyes catching the light. "Let me tell you something. When a man finds something worth protecting, he has two choices. He can hide it, or he can make it a beacon. And which one did you choose?" Luis grinned. "I was foolish enough to make mine a fire." They sat in silence for a long moment. The wind stirred the branches above. In the distance, a hawk wheeled across the pale blue sky. When they finally rose, Luis placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "When they come, they'll bring noise, but you've already found your quiet. Hold on to that." Eli rode back home, heart heavier but steadier. That evening he sat in the kitchen and began writing a new letter, not to the men who threatened him, but to himself. To the man who lost Jonah. To the soldier who came home with bones full of sand and lungs full of silence. To the boy who watched his father's ranch rot because he could not imagine joy without pain. You are still here. You are no longer alone. You have been given something wild, not to tame, but to stand beside, so stand. When he finished, he folded the letter and slid it into the front page of the old ledger. Outside, the sun had slipped behind the hills. Dusk settled like dust on every window pane. Eli walked out to the barn. Midnight lifted his head from the straw and walked over as Eli entered. No lead rope, no bridle, just recognition, just trust. Eli rested his forehead against the horses and closed his eyes. They would come, but so would spring, and some things, once thawed, do not freeze again. The thaw came without warning. One morning the wind shifted from biting to mild, and by midday, rivulets of water carved small paths down the banks of Cold Creek. The snow that had cloaked Red Valley for weeks began to pull back like a tide retreating from shore, revealing soggy grass, broken twigs, and the worn footprints of winter's weight. Eli stood on the porch, his mug warm in his hands, steam rising in slow curls. His gaze drifted over the land he had walked so many times, but this morning it felt different. It always did after the thaw, as if the land remembered too much. It was as if the silence between storms knew what was coming next. Behind him, Midnight stood near the barn door, ears alert, tail swishing slowly. The stallion had grown in the cold, stronger, leaner, a different beast than the one who had once collapsed beneath the cottonwood. Eli didn't need to speak. Midnight moved as he moved. The bond was no longer a fragile thread. It had become a cord woven from shared stillness and long nights. They both felt it, the change. It came first with the rumble of tires on thaw-softened earth, the kind of sound that did not belong in the valley. Too fast, too aggressive. Eli set the mug down gently on the porch railing and walked down the steps. He did not flinch when the black truck appeared again, winding along the lower trail. But he felt the tension rise in his gut, like a tide breaching its banks. Rudd and the younger man from before climbed out, before the truck had fully stopped. This time, they weren't alone. Two more men, heavier, faces hidden behind dark scarves and mirrored glasses. One of them held a coiled rope in one hand and a cattle prod in the other. Eli stepped forward. "I told you once," Rudd held up a gloved hand, "and I told you we'd be back. No more talking this time, Hayes. That animal isn't yours to keep." Midnight stood behind the fence, body still, tail flicking slowly, his eyes locked on the men. Eli didn't move. "He is mine." The younger man laughed, sharp and brittle. "That stallion has a record. You think the world's gonna side with a washed-out soldier and a dangerous horse?" Eli didn't answer, not with words. He reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was the folded paper Luis had given him days earlier, a signed statement from the last ranch where Brimstone had been kept. A confession, a quiet apology in ink. He held it up. "Your mistake is thinking the world doesn't remember the cruelty you leave behind. This horse didn't break free. He was dumped. And I have proof. Rudd hesitated, the smirk sliding from his face. You think a piece of paper is going to stop us? No, Eli said, stepping closer. But I am. He whistled once, sharp and low. From behind the barn, Luis appeared. He carried a shotgun cradled in his arms. Not raised, not pointed, but present. And behind him, 3 more neighbors emerged. Men Eli had not spoken to in months. A woman with her teenage son, both bundled in thick jackets, and the boy holding a phone is already recording. Luis spoke first. We've seen what happens when people take what doesn't belong to them. Not again. Rudd's eyes darted from one face to another, the bravado drained. This isn't your business. It is now, the woman said, because he made it ours. She nodded toward Eli. Because when he stopped hiding, we started remembering who we used to be before fear made us quiet. The younger man stepped back toward the truck. Rudd stood firm for a moment longer, his jaw tightening. You'll regret this. You can't protect him forever. Eli's voice dropped. He doesn't need protection. He needs to be seen. And now he is. Rudd said nothing more. He turned, climbed into the truck, and slammed the door. The others followed. The engine roared to life, wheels spinning in the thawed mud. Then they were gone, swallowed by the curve of the valley. Silence returned. But it was different now. Not empty, not waiting, full. Eli turned to face the small crowd that had gathered. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Lewis stepped forward and clapped a hand on Eli's shoulder. Told you, make it a beacon. Eli nodded, his throat tight. The others dispersed slowly, quiet but firm in their steps. They didn't ask for thanks. They had not come for a reward. They had come because something in the world had shifted, and they had chosen to step toward the change rather than away from it. Later that evening, Eli stood with midnight in the field as the last light faded behind the ridge. The stallion's coat shimmered in the amber glow, his breath slow and steady. You're not a warning anymore, Eli whispered. You're a beginner. Midnight turned his head and pressed it gently against Eli's shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, while the stars woke up one by one, and when they finally walked back toward the house, their shadows stretched long behind them, 2 survivors, side by side, not haunted anymore, but whole. Spring came slowly to Red Valley, creeping in through softened soil and hesitant birdsong. Buds appeared on the cottonwoods by the creek, and tufts of green threaded their way through the ash-gray grass. The frost that had once clung so fiercely to every roof and post surrendered under the pale persistence of longer days. Eli woke with the sun now, not out of habit, but out of want. The air smelled different, alive. Midnight had taken to patrolling the property on his own, with no lead and no saddle. He wandered the fields like he had always belonged, like every inch of dirt and pine was woven into his memory. Eli didn't stop him. He welcomed it. They had both been chained once, Midnight by iron, Eli by silence. But chains rust and break if you leave them long enough in the weather. That morning, Eli found that a part of the old fence had fallen, a long stretch near the back pasture where the posts leaned like tired sentinels. He set out with his hammer and nails, a bundle of fresh cedar boards slung over his shoulder. Midnight trailed him for a while, then darted ahead, trotting lightly through the grass, occasionally snorting as if mocking the slowness of human feet. When they reached the broken fence, Eli paused. The ground here was softer, lower. He knelt beside the splintered post and ran his fingers along the edge. Something had pushed through. Deer, maybe, or elk. Or something larger. He glanced at Midnight, who stood a few paces away, ears twitching. Eli drove the first stake into the soil and began his work. One board, then another. The rhythm of repair was calming, familiar. Every hammer strike felt like a heartbeat, a pulse of purpose. He didn't hear the truck until it was too close to ignore. This one was different. Blue, faded. Dust on the sides like scars. It rolled slowly up the old trail from the east, tires crunching through dry grass and soft clay. Eli stood, hammer still in hand. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She looked about 50, lean and sun-worn, with a weathered canvas coat and eyes that did not flinch. Her hands were calloused, and she carried herself like someone who had spent years with large animals and larger regrets. Eli said nothing. He waited. She nodded once, slowly. His name was Brimstone when I knew him. Eli's jaw tightened. Midnight stepped closer, sensing something strange in the air. The woman took a cautious step forward. I was there the day they loaded him into that trailer, the day they sold him off. I wanted to stop it, but I didn't have the spine then. I didn't speak, so he left. And then he disappeared until I saw the newspaper 2 days ago. Your story. Your photograph. Him. She looked at the stallion now, her voice softening. He looks different, calmer. Eli stepped slightly in front of Midnight, not aggressively, just protectively. Why are you here? To say I'm sorry, her voice cracked. I trained him when he was 3. He was smart, too smart. He needed kindness, not whips, but no one listened. They just wanted a winner, and when he didn't play along, they broke him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a photograph. This was him, before. She handed it to Eli. The image was faded, a younger Midnight, barely grown, eyes still wide with curiosity. A ribbon tied around his neck. Someone had written "Good Boy" on the back. Eli looked at the photo, then back at her. What do you want? She hesitated. Nothing, just to know he's okay. Eli glanced at Midnight, who had moved closer, now standing between them. He sniffed the woman's coat, then exhaled slowly. The woman's eyes filled with tears. He remembers. Eli said nothing. She wiped her eyes quickly. I won't stay. I just needed to see, to know he got one good chapter, that someone gave him a name that didn't mean fire and fury. Eli folded the photo and tucked it into his coat. His name is Midnight now, and he's home. The woman nodded. She turned to go, then paused. Thank you for not turning him into what the world said he was. She left without asking for anything more. When the dust of her truck disappeared beyond the hill, Eli turned back to the fence. Midnight stood beside him, close now. She gave you up, he whispered, but she remembered. He picked up the hammer and went back to work. As the sun climbed higher, the fence rose board by board. Midnight wandered off and returned with a stick in his teeth, tail high, eyes bright. For the first time, Eli laughed, not just a chuckle, a real laugh that reached his ribs and broke something old inside him. That night, he sat by the fire and took out the photo again. He placed it beside a fresh page in his notebook and wrote. He had a name before the chains, a name before the silence, and now he has one after. Not every apology comes with redemption, but some do. Outside, the stars came slowly, like they had been waiting for the world to quiet down. Midnight stood in the field, head lifted to the breeze, unchained, unbroken, and finally, fully seen. Red Valley bloomed in full by mid-April. The land shed its muted winter colors and returned to life with a boldness that felt almost defiant. Wildflowers scattered across the hills like bright confessions. The river, no longer muted by ice, ran quick and sure, curling through the trees with purpose. Birds returned in pairs, and every morning, the air echoed with their songs. Eli rose early now, not because the past haunted him, but because the present invited him. His mornings began with the sound of hooves. Midnight would come to the porch, standing silent beneath the overhang, waiting, not with impatience, but with familiarity, as if to say, I'm here, and so are you. The fence was rebuilt. The barn had been repainted, with the help of neighbors who now visited without excuse. The ranch, once forgotten and sunken into disrepair, pulsed again with quiet purpose. A place not only of survival, but of memory and movement. Eli kept writing. Not for anyone else, just for the ledger. The old leather-bound journal that had traveled with him from war, from pain, from silence, now filled with pages of something new. Not healing exactly, something sturdier, rebuilding. That morning, Eli opened it and wrote, I used to think redemption was a door someone else had to open for you, but maybe it's a trail, rough, unmarked, and maybe you only see it once you stop trying to walk like you used to. He closed the book and stepped outside. The sun had just crested the eastern ridge, casting long gold lines through the trees. Midnight waited near the gate, ears flicking, tail swishing lazily. Eli didn't need a saddle today. Some rides weren't meant for gear. They took the lower trail first, down toward the limestone creek where they had met months ago. The water there had risen just enough to sing again. That spot was quiet now, no chains, no ghosts. Just stones and breeze and the memory of a broken beginning that became something else. Eli dismounted and let midnight wander. The stallion walked into the water, hooves splashing lightly. He lowered his head and drank, then stood still, watching the trees sway above. Eli walked along the bank and found the remains of the chain still rusting under a rock. He knelt, pulled it free, and held it in his hands. It was thinner than he remembered. Weak, a tool of fear that had lost its bite. He didn't throw it away, not yet. Instead, he tied it gently to a branch of driftwood and let the current take it. Not in anger, not in ritual, just letting go. As the river bent, it carried the chain around a turn and out of sight. Midnight watched, then stepped beside him. Together they stood at the edge of the bend, watching the place where the past had floated away. That evening, Eli prepared a fire, not out of necessity. The nights were warmer now, but fire still meant something. He placed the old photograph, the one of Midnight with the ribbon around his neck, on the table beside him. He had not seen the woman again, but she had mailed something last week. No return address, just a small envelope containing a single silver nameplate, Brimstone, etched in clean script. Still shining, untouched by weather. Eli had stared at it for a long time, then flipped it over. Someone had scratched a second name on the back in rough, uneven lines. Midnight. He kept it near the photo. That night, as flames danced low and steady, Eli spoke aloud, not to anyone, but because the air had earned the sound. He was never Brimstone. That name was Fear. Midnight lifted his head from the straw and looked toward him. And fear is no name for something still learning how to trust. In the weeks that followed, word spread. Not fast, not loud, but true. People began showing up. Quietly, carefully. A teenage boy who hadn't spoken in months came with his father. Midnight let him stroke his nose. A widow with shaking hands asked if she could just stand in the barn for a while. A retired vet who hadn't ridden in 20 years sat on the fence and cried without saying a word. Midnight never recoiled. One morning, Eli found a small rock placed on the fence post. Painted on it in crooked blue letters, "Thank you for Midnight." He kept it, placed it beside the journal. As summer approached, the river grew quieter again, but the trails became full. Not of crowds, never that, but of footsteps that carried weight. Eli understood now. He had not saved the horse, they had saved each other. Not in the dramatic flash of one moment, but in the quiet insistence of many. Of sunrises not wasted, of fences rebuilt, of letters burned and words rewritten. Red Valley would always carry scars. So would he, so would Midnight. But they no longer meant ending, they meant beginning. On the final page of the ledger, Eli wrote, "He was chained when I found him, so was I. Now he runs, so do I. Not from anything, but toward something." He closed the book and set it down. Outside, Midnight was waiting by the gate. Eli walked to him. Together, they turned toward the trail. And as they disappeared beyond the bend, the wind carried a sound across the hills. Not a shout, not a cry, but a kind of peace that only comes when the wild is no longer feared, but followed.